Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ellen Eisman. I am the co-chair. It's for SID's International Health and Nutrition Work Group. My co-chair, or I'm her co-chair, is Elvira Barracochea, and we're really excited to have you here after lunch. We think we've got the best panel for the day, and hope you'll be able to stay through the whole thing. It's going to be pretty exciting, and we're going to keep you hopping. So we'll have you moving around and talking to each other, so be prepared. Just a few words about this panel. When we were first proposing what we wanted to talk about, we presented it to the SID board, and they said, you know, refugees is such an important topic, we want you to broaden what you're talking about, not just health. And we were really lucky to find this amazing group of panelists and moderator who have years and years of experience on the subject, and they all come from different places. And we also stepped outside the Beltway and even brought somebody from France. So there you go. I don't think anybody can beat us on distance. But this morning, if you heard Catherine Raphaelson say that there was somebody who came all the way from France, and thanks to the French embassy, that's Benjamin. So we, like I said, we're really excited to have them all here. They bring different perspectives and different aspects to the table on the subject of the refugee crisis. And we're also very pleased to have Rodger de Sousa with us as our moderator. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him before. He's from the Wilson Center, or you've actually heard him speak. He does a lot of moderating and speaking on panels. He's the Director of Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience for the Wilson Center, and it does all fit on his business card. He leads programs on climate change resilience, reproductive and maternal health, environmental security, and livelihoods, including the Global Sustainability and Resilience Program, Environmental Change and Security Program, and Maternal Health Initiative. And he has broad experience that also includes refugees and the subject of the refugee crisis. So I'm going to turn everything over to him. He's going to lead this session. We will let you know when it's time to break into small groups, move around, have conversations. You'll hear a ding here and there that'll give you the indication the conversation's almost over, and bring it all back at the end for some closing remarks. So enjoy the session. Turn it over to you, Rodger. Sorry, in case anybody forgets who you are.
In case I forget who I am. Thank you very much, Ellen, and welcome. I hope you can hear me clearly. And even though we don't have a diversity of gender on the panel, we actually lost a couple of people that we were working with. We have quite an interesting mix of folks to talk to you today about this very important topic. And I think when you think about the refugee crisis moving from immediate emergency to global structure, and as we were thinking about today's session, we wondered what different perspectives we could bring to the discussion and how we can think about how we interact with you. And we're going to start with Brian Hansford, who's the Senior Public Information Officer and spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He's here in DC. And in talking about the session today, I asked Brian a little bit about what does he think is really important. And he said, you know, Rodger Mark, when we look at the magnitude of what we're dealing now, it's staggering, and it really is a question of no continent being spared. I think that's quite revealing. No continent is being spared. And he said, bam, 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 it's happening. What are we doing? How are we responding? How are we coming together? So a very compelling issue for us to have a sense of we think of the magnitude and how we respond. And in talking to Dick Owens, who is the Vice President and Director of Communities in Crisis, that practice area at Bluemont International Relief and Development, where he designs and implements and evaluates programs and projects assisting refugees worldwide. In talking about this issue, you know, Dick said to me, it really is compelling when we look not just at the magnitude, but we realize that no one is going home soon. No one is going home soon. So very, very interesting framing. And when I talked to my colleague John Thorn-Majuk, who is with me at the Wilson Center, where he's a program associate. He was born and raised in South Sudan. Jonathan lived in refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya for about 13 years before coming to the United States. And Jonathan said to me, Rodger Mark, when we think about refugees, we want to move beyond the numbers. We really want to put a human face on this issue. So this is part of what we hope you will get from hearing Jonathan's story, but also what we'll be talking about today. And as we chatted with Benjamin Nugent, who's currently the Director of International Programs and Operations at Secours Islamique in France, he spent 18 years working in humanitarian and development work. Benjamin said, it's quite interesting for me, Benjamin, in Paris, when I talk to my family and interact with them, the visibility of the refugee issue is so prominent now in Paris and in France that people are getting more and more mobilized in different ways, in positive and in negative ways. So it's quite clear for us that this is a compelling issue. It's salient right now. There are increasing numbers. There's a human face to it. People are being mobilized, and we're all wondering, what can we do? How do we act in this space? So that we have a sense of where things are, and we want to know what's the big picture, I'm going to ask by asking Brian to kick us off and talk a little bit about the numbers. What do we know about the numbers? What are they telling us? What are the challenges? What is the situation right now?
Sure. Well, thanks, Rodger Mark, and thank you for
And I'll ask you to speak into the mic so we can hear.
Okay, how's this?
Is that okay?
Everyone?
A little more. They're calling for more, Brian.
Are they calling for more? How's that? Is that a little
okay?
bit better? Okay,
All
thank you.
right.
Well, thank you, Rodger Mark. If you can't hear me, just sort of wave your hands, I suppose. Thank you, Rodger Mark, and thank you for inviting me here today. If you can probably tell from my rather peculiar accent, I'm not an American. I'm from the UK. The UK has a population of roughly 60 million people. And hard to imagine though it is, the fact is that last year 60 million people were forced to flee their homes. Conflict, war, persecution, worldwide 60 million people, roughly the entire population of the United Kingdom. That translates to about 42,500 people fleeing every single day. Now, as Rodger Mark mentioned, each one of these numbers is a person, is a human tragedy, but also a story of human resilience, of human resilience, of human courage, trying to flee for their lives, for their families' lives, to safety. This is the largest number since the end of the Second World War, certainly the largest number that Unhcr has ever dealt with. And it's happening, again, as Rodger Mark alluded to, there's no continent spared. Be it over the past 5 years, 15 wars have either started or reignited in all continents, be it Europe, with Ukraine. Obviously, the Syria crisis is the main driver. We're talking 5 million Syrian refugees now, mostly in the region, mostly in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan. But also, as I said, Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, but also in Africa. So in the past 5 years, 15 conflicts have either started up or reignited. What we're also seeing, not only a large number of conflicts starting up, but also the fewest number of refugees returning to their homes last year in 2014 than at any time in the last 30 years. So these are protracted conflicts, what we call in the UN protracted conflicts, anything longer than 5 years. The average length of time that a refugee spends in a refugee camp is 17 years. Now, before this, from 2010 to 2013, I was in Afghanistan. I spent almost over 2.5 years in Afghanistan. I met people who were born in camps in Pakistan. They'd come back to Afghanistan, but they were now thinking of leaving again because of the conflict continuing. What is UNHCR doing? UNHCR, the UN refugee agencies, with our partners, are sort of first responders, if you like, with our government partners, with our NGO partners, non-governmental organization partners, with our UN agencies and funds and programs partners, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, World Food Programme and others, providing protection, shelter, everything from UNHCR tents to shelter, to clean water, to food, to medical care, as we move on as well, working with UNICEF in education for refugees. The result, though, is that this is a humanitarian system that is stretched. It's stretched to breaking point. And those of you who follow this closely, and all of you, I'm sure, here today and tomorrow in Istanbul is the World Humanitarian Summit, where the world leaders, the United Nations family, are looking at solutions, particularly to the global refugee crisis, to the global displacement crisis. Then it will move on, hopefully building on what happens in Istanbul over today and tomorrow, to the summits here in the US later this year. The UN General Assembly Summit on Refugees and Migrants in September, 19th of September, followed by President Obama's presidential summit a day later, talking about durable solutions for refugees, namely resettlement, but also humanitarian visas, family unification programs as well. I haven't seen the cards being sort of put up in front of me, so I think I have a little bit more time. A little bit more time. Okay, I'm getting the go that I have a little bit more time. But basically, what we want to see, what we hope to see in the World Humanitarian Summit as well, is a realization that this is a global challenge. It requires global solidarity. It's not a challenge of the United Kingdom or France or Germany or any one country, as we're seeing in Europe. You know, Europe is a grouping of over 500 million people. Last year, there were 1 million refugees and migrants who came. This is a manageable solution, a manageable situation if it's managed. Similarly, the situation in the Middle East, it can be managed. However, 86% of all refugees are in developing countries. Lebanon has 25% of its population as Syrian refugees, 1 in 4. That would be the equivalent of the United States taking in over 80 million people. So this is the magnitude of the situation. Each one of those numbers represents a human tragedy, a human story of resilience, and frankly, in the 4 minutes that I've been speaking here today, another 120 people have been forced to flee their homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. So Dick, Brian paints quite a picture for us. 60 million people, the highest number of refugees we've seen. He talks about the number of protracted wars, the degree to which folks are staying in camps, 70 years in a camp. It's quite astounding. Yet he says that there are opportunities for us to manage this. What are your thoughts? What would you add?
Well, I think one thing let me throw out one more number. I hate to do that, but it also helps to put it somewhat in perspective. There are approximately 650,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan, the majority of which are not in official refugee camps. That's roughly the equivalent of the population of the District of Columbia. That's a lot of people. If you are a refugee and you are in Jordan, Lebanon, and you're not in a camp setting, organizations like UNHCR and its implementing partners, IRD, other NGOs, the host nation, are desperately doing the same thing over and over and over again. Our program for the last 4 years in Jordan with the UN and to a lesser extent with the United States Department of State Bureau for Population and Refugees has been the same. Helping the Ministry of Health and other Jordanian government social service providers keep their head above water. They're drowning. Schools run 2.5 shifts a day, 6 days a week. Schools that were finished, brand new schools 3 years ago, look like they're 20 years old. You have people attempting to receive services. You have people in desperate need of health, education, especially girls' education, outside of camps. You also have the situation whereby the simplest and most basic function of the UN and the international relief agencies in these kinds of crises is incredibly difficult to implement. That's protection, basic protection programming. If the refugees are not in camps, you have to find them. They're almost invisible sometimes. You have to register. You have to register births, marriages, deaths, change in marital status. All of that impacts their ability to get services, to access services, and to continue to maintain themselves in those host communities. While at the same time, the host communities are feeling that impact of, as in Lebanon, 25% of your population being non-Lebanese, competing for the same social services, for the same employment opportunities. They're not going anywhere soon. It's time, it's long past time to take a long, hard look at the international community's approach to how we're dealing with this. I know in some spheres of the US government and elsewhere, developmental relief is no longer a term that's in vogue, but that's what we need. We need more development programming in the host countries that are receiving the refugees. And we all need to understand that these are sovereign nations. Stop blaming Jordan and Turkey and others. They're doing the best they can under extremely difficult circumstances. This has to be a partnership going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick. So Dick, just to go back to this point that you made about this flow of people not being in camps. Why are they not in camps? Is there not the capacity to receive them? What's the issue here?
Well, I think there are two principal issues here, and I think the UN, especially the Unhcr, understands this better than anybody else because they lead in this world. But that size of a population that cross borders over an extended period of time does not lend itself to anything that could be considered an organized type of response on a consistent basis. The other issue is, in my point of view, is if I'm a refugee, and I've never been a refugee, I've worked in refugee camps and IDP camps all over the world. I would rather be in a host community taking my chances on the local economy than sitting in a tent someplace in the middle of the desert. I'm sorry.
So Brian, when you think a little bit about how Dick talks about this issue, he says we're doing the same thing over and over and over. As someone working on the front lines of these issues, that must be very frustrating. Where are we making progress? What could we be doing better?
No, I think agreeing with Dick in certainly. I mean, I worked with the Cambodian refugees in '89, actually for the IRC, the International Rescue Committee on the border, in a Thai camp, in Khao Dang camp, and I go back, UNHCR was running the camp with the Thai border agency and with IRC as well. And the same issues of protection, of giving education to refugees, basic sort of trying to provide a basic level of decency for refugee families, who in this case had been fleeing the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But I see it mirrored consistently in what I've done in the past, since 1989, over the past few decades. We are making certain, and it's not that donors are not being generous, for example, no more so than the United States. The United States is one of the top donors to the humanitarian crisis in Syria. It resettles more refugees than any other country. But it's similarly, the European Union is very generous. There is progress being made, but the issue is that the extent of the problem, 60 million people, the entire population of the United Kingdom. I mean, it's donors have been generous, but our needs are far outstripping the resources that we have. And that's why there needs to be a global response. There needs to be global solidarity in terms of resettling refugees, in terms of realizing that refugees bring benefits to communities, as they also bring, they send back remittances or whatever to the communities that they've left. I mean, nobody chooses to be a refugee. If you look, the United States is built on refugees and immigrants, and I think there's a wonderful tradition here in the US. Since 1975, the United States State Department has resettled over, I think, 3 million refugees since '75. The boat people, et cetera, who have contributed immensely to the community, the societies that they've come into. I mean, much more needs to be done, certainly.
So, Jonathan, I wanted to build off what we've been hearing from both the panelists so far. And one of the things that Dick mentioned was host communities, and he talks a little bit about, our ability to understand that there are communities that are receiving these populations, and they're doing what they can do to a certain degree, but at times there are misunderstandings at different dimensions of this issue. You have lived this directly. This is your part of your life story. It doesn't define all of who you are, but it's a complex situation. There are misperceptions. What do you think people need to understand?
Thank you, Roger Mark, and thank you for tuning in here. Before I answer the question, how many of you have been refugees before? Raise your hands. Okay. How many have visited the refugee camps? Okay. So you understand the context. Thank you. There are two main misconceptions about refugee, Roger Mark, and one is that people often see refugees as just victims. They are just passive victims without capacities. But the fact that they have been pushed away from their homes by civil war, by persecution, and eroding security situation does not define them as passive victims. So that's one misconception. The second misconception is that because they are just passive victims, their health is narrowed to PSTD only. And that is a misconception. So building from that, I've been talking about refugees not just as victims, but also as models of resilience. They are not just victims, they are also example of human resilience. And by defining resilience in this situation, there are two conditions. One, there has to be a presence of a tragic situation or a diversity. That's one. So number two in defining individual resilience is that amidst that tragic situation, there is also a positive adaptation. And that's what most or some refugees have demonstrated. And so they are not just victims, they are also assets to be utilized to address the push factors that compel them or force them to leave their homes. And along that line, I would also add that there are real defining needs of refugees as a specific population. They are protected groups, of course. One of them here is that they have been separated from their family members or their homelands or their villages, from their way of life, and they've been placed to a different territory. So that separation, especially for children, I was among those statistics that Brian was talking about for 13 years. And now I graduated from refugee status, and I'm a global citizen. So refugee status is temporary. It's supposed to be temporary, but that's not a defining issue because these people also have human dignity and their identity. I want to add also to that, that when refugees cross borders and go to host communities, because of those misconceptions, they also encounter some of the issues that remind them of what the situation they've been through before. And along that is what the literature called ambiguous loss. For me, when I left at that early age and lived in the refugee camp in Ethiopia, I had that ambiguous loss for a long time because I didn't know whether my parents were present or alive. Whether they were dead or alive, present or absent, in my mind. That's what ambiguous loss is. And then along that is that separation from the homeland. So those are some of the needs, especially for young children and for the elderly and for the women. They have these needs in the refugee camps. So in the refugee camp that I lived for about 10 years in Kenya, recently you have heard that the Kenyan government decided to close the refugee camps. One in Dadaab, which is the largest refugee camp in the world, with Somalia refugee. They delayed the Kakuma refugee camp closure, where majority of South Sudanese live, and that's the camp I grew up for 10 years. So when you hear this situation, why are hosting countries deciding to do something like this? Why do they want to force refugees to return to their homeland amid the persecution? One of the things is they are frustrated with the system. The humanitarian system is now not responding to the needs of the 21st century. The protracted situation where the refugee now, on average, live in the refugee for 17 years, it was supposed to be temporary. So the system is stretched thin to address the main issues that the refugees are going through. So I want to bring this attention to the humanitarian workers, to the world attention in general, that don't treat refugees just as victims. They are also assets to be used, and they can help in addressing the push factors by being effective agents for positive change. And I hope you can join with former refugees to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So, Benjamin, we've been talking a little bit about, you and I have chatted a little bit about reactions to refugee flows in Paris, in France, and beyond within Europe. But what's your sense of what's not understood, what's misunderstood within the European context? We've talked a little bit about this being a global issue, but what are you hearing and experiencing on the ground in Europe?
Well, I think that what is important to take into account is there is quite a change, because basically, well, as we are all aware, it's not only data we're speaking about, it's human beings. But the point is that basically for a lot of citizens in Europe, or maybe in North America, but in Europe right now, I mean, those people, they were just data in the newspapers, maybe couple of images on screens, should it be TV or the internet or whatever. And right now in Paris, what is changing is that you have a lot of families, Syrian families, living in the streets of Paris. So every day, people going to buy their bread, going to the supermarket, whatever, are just living with refugees' families. And I think it's a huge change, because basically those people are not living away any longer. I mean, they are our neighbors. They are becoming our neighbors, and there is what I call the neighboring factor. And basically, I mean, you get upset or you can become friends with your neighbors. So about becoming friends, basically you have a lot of very, very nice initiatives of people just sharing on a daily basis. So bringing food, or supporting the kids, or a group of doctors providing medical cares for free, people providing medicines and whatever. On the other hand, you are people getting upset and getting groups of, well, let's say extremists, just starting to fight about, I mean, those people should not live here. Well, so it's really a change of paradigm, I think, for all of us, because basically there is something changing for us as humanitarian actors, but also for the citizens in Europe. That's very, very important. Well, the second point, which should be understood, is that in Europe, we have this refugee crisis, which is not a global refugee crisis, but a kind of sliced one. Because basically, due to the reaction of people and governments, borders, as you know, have been closed. So the Schengen Agreement, which allow a lot of people to travel, I mean, all people to travel all along Europe without any barrier, just somehow disappearing, and because of the refugee crisis. And some decision has been taken about, like, pulling people, closing the border, and pushing people away. which is like we treat the people we have in the border, but we do not treat the crisis as a whole. So that's really a matter of concern in terms of European construction. The European institutions are somehow jeopardized because basically some very fundamental agreements of Europe since the very beginning about people being able to travel, it's something which is somehow disappearing. Last point, which is maybe a positive point, I would say, is that in the change of paradigm as well, is that we have the kind of e-crisis, because basically a lot of refugees right now are just coming and they have some money, they have some passport, and they have iPhones. And basically what is very amazing, I mean, in the street of Paris, in the street of Athens, wherever, is that, I mean, people get access to information and they want to build their life, they have a goal, so sometimes they want to reach Germany or the UK or whatever, and they try to find their way, and they are using those new tools we were speaking about in plenary. So that's also very important in terms of change of paradigm, and I think that we should really, really take the opportunity of using those new tools as well.
Thank you. So I wanted to get back to both of you, and you, Jonathan, you specifically spoke about refugees being an asset and the potential of refugees to be an asset. And I know recently we were talking about this, and you mentioned the ways in which refugees have been assets to host communities. And I think many people were very, very surprised to hear this. Could you talk a little bit more about this? How do you see refugees being an asset at various stages of their journey, or any additional thoughts with regard to that idea?
So when refugees become refugees by crossing the border to another country, they become refugees there in their new host community. What happened first is a friction between the two groups, because the newcomers are new and nobody trusts who they are, whether they are posing a security threat or not. But eventually, as they coexist with the UN agencies providing assistance to refugees in terms of food, education as a public good, those local people, especially in the neglected region of a host country, become also to benefit from the refugee benefit that is offered by the UN. That could be a source of also tension, but also a source of peaceful coexistence in terms of public good, with education as an example. So in the context of the Kenyan refugee camp, for example, I live in the Turkana region for those about 10 years. And education was a key factor there, and the only main asset that the refugee can get out of refugee camps, because even refugee camps are not secure. So let's assume that the Kenyan government is closing a refugee camp in the local Turkana district, where their kids were benefiting from refugee education as well. If the government does not provide those benefits after expelling refugees, what would be the reaction of the local people to the decision of their government? So that's one way. Coming to the United States, for example, as a resettled refugee here, which is different from my first refugee home, refugees, when they are given the opportunity, the right to work, if they are integrated in the society, they can productively contribute in a formal way. And that's also add to the global treasury, where they are also part of the donors. So if a local community sees that they are assets, they can integrate them into their society, which is what the United States of America does. And so that's another way, Roger Mark, being integrated and given the right to work, so that to be productive, and also to maintain the human dignity by doing that, because nobody wants to be a recipient of aid for a very long time. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be on the receiving side all the time. So given the opportunity, being integrated in the society, if they are given the right to work, then they can actually contribute productively. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, Benjamin, you talked about these opportunities whereby you're seeing refugees coming in now, where they have iPhones, they have access to information, and you're saying this is an opportunity that we should think about harnessing. What are some of the other opportunities you see out there for us to think about how we better deal with these set of issues? What's innovative? What's cutting edge now that we, as a development community, need to be aware of, that we should be cognizant of, that we should be thinking about scaling up or replicating? What's new? What's innovative? Where are the greatest opportunities for us now?
Well, I think that what's important is this wave of compassion. I mean, well, I was speaking about, yes, I mean, far-right parties, all this. But basically, I would say that in Europe, you have much more compassion. And I think that that's something we can build on. In my organization is working from Syria to the north of France. And basically, we have volunteers every day coming and say, what can we do? We know that Secours Islamique is working with the refugees. What can we do? Can we bring some food? Can we bring some clothes? Whatever. Can we volunteer on a daily basis? So I think there is really, really compassion, and that's something that we should build on, especially, I mean, to implement actions in Europe. People proposing to welcome families in their houses, people proposing new opportunities, like, I mean, I saw recently a young guy who was just proposing to transform unused offices into space for refugees, and with a young architect. So there are a lot of initiatives of people wishing to contribute, and there is a real social mobilization, not to say political mobilization, around this crisis, which is brand new to me.
How do we build on that compassion and the political and social mobilization that can come out of it? So we've presented you with a lot of issues in a short period of time. A very important framing, recognizing the magnitude of the issue, the degree to which some of this is driven by conflict and wars, the degree to which people are spending protracted times in camps. We talked about refugee resilience. We talked about the humanitarian community serving as first responders, protection, shelter, tents, food, healthcare. We talked about opportunities such as the humanitarian summit, the summits that will occur in September, the presidential summit. We've recognized that there are opportunities to take action, that it's a global challenge. We've talked about attitudes and perceptions in host communities, looking at different models of resilience, health dimensions and challenges for refugees, innovative programming and opportunities. So now, checking to see if anyone's asleep, we're going to pull all of this together on the small tables. If you look at your table, you see you have a handout with questions or roundtable discussion. We have two key questions there for you. How would you synchronize and make convergence the efforts being made? How do you bring it all together? Or what could you be doing to advance the discussion in your current role to contribute to the broader community? Think about where you are. If you're doing work on learning, for example, we were talking about earlier, how could you bring this to leverage on this issue? So we'd like you and your tables to choose one of these questions and to discuss it for about 20 minutes. My fellow panelists and I will come around, sit with you for a little bit, chat with you for a little, and then we'll debrief quickly and get to your questions and interaction with the panel overall. So get started. Ellen, I know, is walking around, making sure everyone has a sheet, and my colleagues and I will come around and join you and chat with you a little bit. So, and we have about 20 minutes for this.
That's all. Solve all the problems we haven't been able to for the last 2 decades.
Exactly.
You know, technology does not change everything or even anything, but it opens a lot of doors. on our cross-border
So you
programs
guys want to take this side?
from Jordan and northern Iraq
we
into
just
Syria.
invite them.
We
You
have
guys want to take this side of the room?
Okay.
Yeah.
Go to any particular.
Yeah, go to any table, spend 5 or 10 minutes, and go to another table because there's so many tables. So go to a couple, and then we come back up.
It changes the way you do programs.
ding, and then I'll say ding. Hi, folks. You heard the ding. Just to let you know, you have about 5 more minutes. 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene as a group. All right, so if we can ask our panelists to come back up. Jonathan, Benjamin, Brian. Okay, so what we'd like to do now is we're not going to ask you to report out on your discussions per se, but what we'd like to do is ask a few of you, if were there any volunteers, to talk briefly about what you heard at your table that surprised you. Was there anything that was new or innovative or unexpected, something that you just didn't anticipate that came up in your conversation? You said, oh, that's a different perspective. Oh, I hadn't thought that we could collaborate in this way. Oh, I didn't know that. New, different, unexpected. What came up in your conversation? You said, oh, that's a new perspective for me. Anyone? We have one of our colleagues who will come to you with the microphone. Everyone's rushing. Come on, guys. Who wants to go first? Yeah? Yes? Someone's volunteering her neighbor.
Hi. Hello, my name is Jessica. We had some interesting discussions. I'm learning a lot. I'm a graduate student, so I'm learning a lot right now. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, I had heard about this a little bit, but I think Lila shared about how, so instead of having refugees just waiting around in the camp, providing opportunities for education through using app or online learning. So either using like solar-powered batteries to charge like iPads, for example. We thought, okay, so about like, how do you synchronize this? We were thinking that having like communities of practice. So instead of, sometimes it's good to have like 10 different approaches. So once like different organizations, once an organization that finds an approach that works, instead of just them using it, sharing it with other organizations, so synchronizing an approach that works and then sharing that with other NGOs or other organizations that can then implement it, so that we're not each trying to do our own thing, but then once you have something that works, everyone can use it across the board and then keep going and finding other things that work as well.
Great. And did you guys talk about why that does not happen? Because we know, you know, we talk about these new and innovative ideas as a development community, and we say, you know, we need to share more. Part of what we also talk about is we need to be able to share our failures more. So also what's not working, what we need to stop doing. So I'd encourage us to think a little bit about that. I think it's great, but why are we not doing it more? How can we be incentivized as a community to come together and do that? Do we need to convince the donors that yes, you know, this is some of the areas that they could be putting money in? Just throwing thoughts and reactions out. Okay, anyone else? Interesting thoughts, ideas, surprises? Anything from your table that you thought, yes, great?
So my name's John Dawkins. I'm with a company called Nightingale International in emergency medicine training and air medical transport. So in our group, the one thing that we came up with that I liked that was concrete was we came up with something that you have to really have a foundation in order to really bring any consistency, that all these divergent groups going from the UN organizations to national governments to groups within national governments. I mean, you know where I'm going with this. And famously, this stuff does not get coordinated. And famously, people don't have a forum to be able to support one another and not. Anyway, so the one thing is you really have to have a policy which is agreed upon by the stakeholders. And you have to have somebody who kind of steps forward and develops a policy. And in particular, I would say the policy needs to focus on people that are less educated, because anybody that's got money and is well educated, they're going to make sure they themselves get integrated. You know, I've lived in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2001 in Afghanistan, November, and then I left that region, and I was on the ground in 2012, end of 2012. So I've seen this stuff. But basically, you have to have develop a consistent and policy, which is the foundation, which is conducive to making an environment which is going to breed success, which is going to breed hope, and is going to enable integration into the communities. So that seems to me as the core foundation that you have to really have to start in order to actually have a hope of having the groups integrate and have, as you guys put it, convergent efforts. So the thing that I found frustrating, I've been the owner of a company, so I'm used to decisions and execution, and you do it. But talking to some people in our group that have worked more in politics, the obvious second thing would be you want to have a lead organization which is relatively neutral and relatively non-political that can be the driver. And if you don't have that, first of all, you got to have the policy. Second, you got to have a driver that people are actually going to give credibility to. So, and talking to some people at my table and thinking about it, I realized that most people who are putting up their money, or stakeholders, are not going to listen to a neutral group. But anyway, if there's some way those two things could get put in place, to me that's your starting point. And that was kind of the two things that I felt like sharing.
Okay, great, thank you. And I would say we have someone here. I would say, think also, were there any questions that came up in your group that you found you really couldn't answer? Do you have any additional questions for the panel?
Yeah, my name is Austin Schott. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I guess in that light of what questions we struggled to answer, and along with this second question of what could we do to advance the discussion, what can we contribute to the broader community, we were wondering how to spread knowledge about the assets that refugees can bring. We talked about that earlier, about what refugees can bring to communities in the long term, and also to both host communities, to refugees themselves, and the benefits they can possibly bring to their original nations in the long term. One of the issues we had is there's a lot of stereotypes about refugees in especially US and Europe right now, reflecting the Syrian refugee crisis. And we were wondering, how do we kind of combat those stereotypes? I guess we kind of looked at 3 different areas in that we sought to just educate our local communities, just kind of create discussions, whether it's blog posts, whether it's just having compassion on refugees in our areas, or whether it's just creating those conversations. We also think that pushing policy that reflects the positives of refugees is important. And also, we talked a little bit about private enterprise and private sponsorship of refugees, and pushing that in communities can also kind of improve those assets and bring those assets to our communities.
Great, thank you. We'll take a few more, and then we'll come to the panel for some reaction. Yes, please.
Hi, I just have one question that I kind of was starting to think about just right now when you start speaking, but I kind of feel like we always tend to try to find solutions to problems that we face, but looking around today, and thank you so much for all of your presentation, but I can't read your name from here, so I'm sorry. John, you were talking about your refugee experience. And I was wondering, you asked us earlier on how many refugees were in the room, and there wasn't, I don't remember there was anyone but yourself. So why do we always assume that we have the answers? Why don't we ask refugees, what can you provide to your communities and to the countries that you can go to, and actually have them tell us what they can provide, rather than us going around and trying to figure out something as if it's a mystery out there when we,
Great.
they're human beings.
Great, thank you. Yes, please. Up front here, yes? Ellen, what's going on here? This side of the room is quiet. Hello. Coffee, all right. Let's go quickly, because we want to give them time to respond.
Yes, Deborah Robinson, School for International Training, World Learning. And it really came from John's question. So my question is, or John's comment, isn't UNHCR the entity that's supposed to be coordinating, like everybody's supposed to be going through, or is that only in those refugee camps that you organize? But so if you could, or anyone could say a little bit about, is there someone coordinating? And then the issue that was also brought up, well, for those who aren't in the official camps, then how it's reached. But so if we came up with ideas, or various organizations wanted to impact or be involved, yeah, who's coordinating?
Okay, great. Yes, please, and then we come to this side. Go ahead, quickly.
Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne. I'm with IRD, so thank you, Dick, for making us proud today. Just a point maybe from, from any one of the panelists. Some of us have worked in this industry for a while, and a lot of the questions here, some of us can answer. But I would like to would really like to get your ideas about the funding piece. Because at the end of the day, it's about the money and how much the international community is willing to give, how much host nations are willing to expend, and how much is the stuff that we actually cannot do.
Great.
There are that many people moving around the world, and there's a lot of strings attached. If I'm, country X in Eastern Europe, if I'm country Y in North Africa, if I'm the United States, at the end of the day, where do those monies go? And I think that's ultimately one of the fundamental questions. So maybe
Great.
some thoughts about that.
Great. Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Wayne Young. I'm with Port of Harlem Magazine, so I'm here covering the event, actually. Oh, okay. My name is Wayne Young. I'm with Port of Harlem Magazine and with Inclusive, Diverse, Pan-African Magazine. I'm here actually to cover the event. But first, I wanted to answer the lady's question. I just wanted to give a piece of information out. The lady mentioned about groups of refugees that provide answers, and there is one, we covered them before, and I think it's called the Congress of Refugees, and I think the U.S. government actually sponsors it. The second, the group here, though, what I heard from the group here, that they spoke of there being many players, but that with the many players, there's not an organization for the players to answer to. And then, if they did answer to them, hopefully they will collect data, and they will use the data, but then there'd be the discussion of whether or not all the players would be data-driven in their decision-making.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So I know we have a few more. There's time for networking afterwards, but given that we have just a few more minutes, let's see if we can get to the panel. Is that okay? So a few questions for you to consider. How can we better share what's working? How can we share our failures? How can we increase coordination? If there's policy and those who drive policy, how can we bring those issues together? How can we spread knowledge about the assets of the refugee population? How can we help deal with stereotypes? How can we better engage refugees in the process? What's the role of Unhcr? Is that one of coordination? Who else is coordinating? How can we better reach those who are not in the camps? The funding question. And ultimately, should we realize that even if we got all of the funding that we wanted, is there just part of it that we just can't deal with? Is that part of this question? And if there are many players, to what degree are these players using data and evidence to inform decisions that are being made with regard to these processes? So a short list of questions, and you can address one or two if you'd like. And Benjamin, may we start with you?
Thanks. Well, quite challenging questions.
And just speak into the mic, please.
Yeah. Well, I would say that maybe the first point and the critical point is the funding questions. You're right. Well, I'm sure that when a community faces a critical situation, the community is able to mobilize itself. So, well, I don't know who is going to pay, but I'm sure that, well, we're facing a very critical situation, and I'm convinced that, well, should there be a political will, we'll find a means. So the point is for us to build the knowledge and to ring the bell and say, well, what is happening is having quite an impact on, well, the daily life of the citizens, on an impact on millions of people, and may have an impact on the institutions in Europe or elsewhere. So I think that it's a matter of building the knowledge and make some proper advocacy to convince the key stakeholders, those taking decisions about where to invest the money. And we know from some research that, well, for each dollar invested on a refugee, I think it's after 2 years, this dollar is get back to the community at a rate of 1.42 or something like this. So which is a kind of investment. Okay, so my dream would be that, well, there is a kind of, let's say, strong political will and something like, yes, we can invest and it will be impactful for the community as a whole. I mean, the humankind community, if I can say so. So, yes, I think there is a need to build knowledge in order to build proper advocacy.
Okay, great. Jonathan?
I will take the few questions. How do we spread knowledge about refugee being assets or so? One of the ways, of course, here is to talk about success stories. So if you work with refugees or you have worked with refugees before and they graduated from refugee status, for example, those who are resettled here in the Western countries, then they become effective voices in generating resources also for your organization or for that matter for the humanitarian emergencies regarding refugees. The other is, of course, you can blog about those success stories so others can reach what has been published. That's one way. And you can think of anything that you can highlight about a former refugee. Where are they now? Following them in their trajectory to success. Regarding IDP, those who are internally displaced within the border of their countries, I think they go through similar situation with refugees, except they are within the border of the organization. So whatever the refugees are suffering from or going through in the refugee camps where they are hosted, IDPs also go through. So I think it's a question of how UN agencies are helping those. I will defer to Brian, but the magnitude of the needs that the IDP go through is also similar. Coming now finally to the funding question, that's an issue. The needs have overpowered the humanitarian system, and there is a huge gap in funding, which cause other hosting countries to frustrate, like what has happened in East Africa. So how do we deal with this? The humanitarian system that was reformed after the Second World War is not dealing or responding effectively to the needs of the 21st century. So it needs overhaul. It needs to be reformed so that crises are, or the response to crisis is proportionate to the magnitude of the crisis. Apparently, today is not, and I think it's something we need to deal with. But to effectively address refugee plight, we have to address the root causes of the refugee plight. And I think that's the responsibility of the countries that are fighting the war, but also of the international community, to help them develop preventive measures so that we prevent crisis from occurring. It is expensive to deal with crisis after we allow them to occur. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Dick?
Believe it or not, there's a little bit of a ray of light here. Not a lot, but a little bit. I can't remember the name of the legislation, but I just had to help write a response to it. Last week, U.S. Congress passed legislation, not this term, but I believe a year ago, that now requires U.S. government agencies funding emergency relief programs for refugees, displaced people, host communities, to actually be accountable to them. And it states, and State Department Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration is taking this on very aggressively and leading the effort. Yeah, you have to talk to them. You have to talk to them about the kind of programs that are priorities for them, how the programs are doing. Are they getting what they said they were going to get? Is it appropriate? Is it effective? Should they be receiving something else? You need to actually talk to the people you're serving and supporting. That's first. I've been doing this for a long, long time, and it's a requirement. That also potentially takes us down the road where we need to be, because there is no sort of global entity that leaps into action and coordinates everything that happens in a major disaster. Common view of the situation. We work for 3 different donors in Lebanon. Each donor has different information, reporting, and data requirements. How the heck can they know and coordinate among themselves when their implementing partners are required to do different things and report on different things? At some point, the international relief community is going to have to look at the whole big data thing. How do you establish a common data platform? Who does that? How do you manage it? How do you generate data? Where do you put it? How does it get analyzed? How is it used by program operators and policymakers? And there isn't anybody in the international relief community that could actually implement that, so we're going to have to go outside and find somebody eventually that could do that for us.
Thank you very much. Brian?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the... I'm the last to answer, I think. So loads of questions, great questions. Yes, if I may go to the first one about UNHCR, yes, the the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees coordinates the response for the refugee situation in terms of emergencies, in terms of support. But as sort of Dick mentioned, with hundreds and hundreds of partners, we work with government agencies. I've been in Lebanon, I've lived and worked in Afghanistan and places. Very, very difficult in terms of working with government agencies which have certain recording data processes or not, with agencies which have varying different ones as well. But in terms of the UN system, we are the lead agency from the 1951 Refugee Convention, mandated by the General Assembly to focus on refugees. The humanitarian system, though, is, going back to the funding question, how much is enough? Is there ever going to be enough money? Frankly, no, because donors have been generous, but needs are far outstripping the resources that we have. And that's why this two-day meeting, the World Humanitarian Summit, is important. And what we've been doing with institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank in particular, to try and get this, I think the posh term for it is the development humanitarian nexus, which means basically development longer-term funding for humanitarian needs that we have, the immediate emergency needs, which, as Dick has mentioned, we're talking, decades of needs, basically. The Afghan situation has been going on for over 30 years. Syria is now into its 6th year. Protracted crises for the UN system is anything over 5 years. And again, I've spoken about refugee camps, but as has been highlighted here, most refugees are not in refugee camps. They're living in with host communities. I spent months in 2014 on emergency missions in Lebanon, a month last year as well, 1,700 different locations, no formal refugee camps in Lebanon, but living with Syrian refugees are living with host communities, with Lebanese. So the strains on already rickety sort of infrastructure. Don't forget, Lebanon had a civil war for 15, 20 years or so. So it's this sort of financing. We need to look at the humanitarian financing, the development financing. And in terms of getting more information, I mean, UNHCR.org, I'm plugging UNHCR, UNrefugees.org, which is the USA for UNHCR funding charitable group that we have, which funds money for us. But refugees are, going back to what John said, refugees, they're an asset. Steve Jobs, crikey, what a Syrian he was. Albert Einstein, what a refugee he was. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. So I think if you think of today's panel and the panelists, you've had a Frenchman, a South Sudanese, someone from Latin America and the Caribbean, an American, and a Brit. So lots of different perspectives coming together to talk to you about this issue. I hope that you come away from today's discussion having learned at least one new thing. I think that as you reflect on the discussion that we had, I hope that you think about how you can integrate this into your work. I hope that you've heard some ideas that you disagree with, and you think that I would modify that in a way that suits you. And finally, I hope you come away energized. I hope you come away thinking, you know what, that was a good session. We covered a lot, gave me some food for thought, and now I have some opportunities to network. So please join me in thanking our panelists and our conveners. And I think we have some time for networking. I think we are available, so please engage us further if you'd like. Thank you. It was great.